You're listening to the Deep End Podcast, a ministry of Hermitage Church, where we have a conversation about Sunday's sermon and chat about ways we can go a little deeper in our faith. I'm Hunter Steinmetz, and I'm one of the pastors here at our church. Every week, we will listen in on a conversation with the preacher from this week about deeper theological pieces of the sermon and suggested practices on how we can embody this word and allow it to seep into our skin. We hope that this podcast will become a part of your weekly faith journey on your drive into work, as you do the dishes, or as you sip your coffee on Tuesday mornings. Thanks for jumping into the deep end with us. Let's listen in on this week's conversation.
Welcome back to the Deep End. I'm Brad.
And I'm Hunter. We're glad that you have joined us. Today, we're launching into a brand new sermon series on the scroll of Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel. And if you've ever tried to read Ezekiel before, you know there's lots of stuff happening. It's like a psychedelic book. It's pretty intense. But we're going to kind of dive into that.
Yeah, it is definitely, I like the word psychedelic because it is just kind of, it's wild.
Yeah, it's wild. We can just acknowledge it.
Yeah, and even moving that further, like there's visions of wheels within wheels, dry bones coming to life, shocking metaphors that kind of point to Israel's history of being unfaithful. And then there's some of these unique occurrences called sign acts, which we'll talk about a little bit, where Ezekiel acts out God's message. It's not an easy book, but it's one of these books that are very powerful in the Old Testament and that shape a people.
And so one of the big things that we want to do, over the next 5 or 6 weeks as we work through the book of Ezekiel is to set the stage. That way, when you actually come to worship on Sunday, you know a little bit more about who Ezekiel is. So who is Ezekiel? What is happening in Israel's story at the time of this writing? And why does this book even matter for us today?
Yeah, so even to begin, we'll just try to orient ourselves historically, which will throw a few dates and a few timelines in Israel's history. And if you do want to go and do some more research, you can do some fun rabbit trails. These are kind of just glossing over, which we've mentioned them before in previous podcasts. But at this point in Israel's story, we are well past these kind of what we would call like golden years or kind of the good years within Israel's history, at least in the biblical text. The years of King David and Solomon. And as we've talked about before, the kingdom had split after Solomon, the northern kingdom called Israel, and their capital Samaria, and the southern kingdom called Judah, their capital being Jerusalem.
And we've talked about this, if you've listened to the podcast at all, we try and hit this home a lot, that there is only 3 kings in the united monarchy of what we think is Israel, what we understand as Israel. There's Saul, there's David, there's Solomon, and then the kingdom split into those 2 kingdoms. So now by the time Ezekiel begins prophesying, the northern kingdom is no more. Assyria had come in, and it was conquered in 722 BCE. And so, at the end of Genesis, the 12 sons of Jacob are then split up, and they become tribes, and Assyria begins forcing mass deportations. They scatter the population. So the entire northern kingdom, when they are conquered, and they only really existed for like 150 years, all of those tribes, they just kind of get lost. We can't really trace them. So that's if you've ever heard the term the lost tribes of Israel, it was all the tribes that lived in the northern kingdom.
Yeah, and a side note, the number 12 is really unique because it comes up all over the biblical text, and it kind of symbolizes, I don't know if it's like perfection. The number 7 pops up a lot too from the days of creation.
Yeah, there's 12 disciples.
Yeah.
And it's on purpose.
Yeah. So Ezekiel isn't from the north. He's from the south, Judah. And that kingdom lasted a little bit longer. They were walking this similar path, though, as the other corrupt kings, injustice, idolatry, and misplaced trust in these foreign alliances.
And the big empire on the block is no longer Assyria. Assyria had tried to take over Judah for a very long time, and they failed to do that. Its new empire, Babylon, that takes over Assyria, all that they had in the northern kingdom, and including the southern kingdom. So now Babylon has conquered all of the land that we used to call the united monarchy of Israel. Israel and Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms, belong to Babylon. So now by the late 600s and early 500s BCE, Babylon is flexing its power across the ancient Near East, and Judah was caught in the middle, trying to juggle loyalty to Babylon and secret hopes that Egypt would come and bail them out. And so I want to say one thing, too, that an interesting thing of when they settle, and this is like Ezekiel 3, they're in this community in a place called Tel Aviv, which the modern city that we know as Tel Aviv was
it's super unique.
Yeah, they name it because of this. But that name, it really means like ancient ruins. The Tel is kind of like ancient ruins and like more of like an archaeological term. And then Aviv is more like springtime. It's like something new is happening. So they're calling this place old but new is really what Tel Aviv means. That it has an old story, but that's not its entire story. That something refreshing is happening.
Which goes even more so with a lot of names throughout the Old Testament. They always point to something much deeper than just a name. We talked about that some in the Genesis class. Like all of the names throughout Genesis typically point to a much deeper meaning within the narrative. But in this context, there's this deep tension. So it kind of speaks to this tension. Some of the exiles wanted to fight their way back to Judah in this moment. And then there were others here who held on to kind of this understanding, this theology that Jerusalem was completely untouchable and that God would never allow it to fall completely.
And so Ezekiel steps into this moment as both a prophet and a priest. But the thing is, he is now a priest without a temple. And he is a prophet that's separated from the people back in Judah. And this is a difficult kind of identity crisis. There is no temple because Babylon has destroyed it. And he was exiled to Babylon. And so he is not with the people that he is supposed to be prophesying to. So this is setting up an interesting... He is not in the same geographical location, and there is not a temple anyway. It has been destroyed. So is God doing this, or just the people doing this? There's lots of questions that all of Judah is asking.
And it, like you said, it sets up kind of what the opening chapters, and how they unfold. In chapters 1 through 3, he has this overwhelming vision of God's glory that is very image-rich. In this image, there's this chariot throne with wheels within wheels, carried by these living creatures.
And it's like psychedelic, like you said. There's lots going on. But the big point is that God's glory is not stuck in Jerusalem. Like God's resting place may have been in the temple at some point, but it was never just the temple.
That's like a pause moment. It's so unique.
That so what if Babylon destroys the temple? You think that so God's just done now? They won? That's not how this works.
Yeah.
So the big point is like the wheels are showing movement. There's something's happening. God's glory is not stuck in Jerusalem. It does not belong to the temple. God is mobile. He is with his people and even in exile. And this also speaks to like really early on, because Solomon, they build the temple much later. But God never really wanted that. He was a tabernacle God. They would build a tabernacle and go to a different place. Yeah. God was nomadic and didn't want to be stationary.
Yeah. It was kind of like, if you're going to do this, then okay.
Yeah, fine.
But that's,
And then what happens later on, Paul tells us, guess what? God's on the move again.
Yeah.
Now you're the temple. I was never intended to just stay still.
My glory
I'm going
fills
with you.
You
are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and you're on the move too.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, God gets the last word. It's so great.
But so that's super unique, like starting with this. And kind of like we mentioned, there's this big point that God's glory is not stuck in Jerusalem. And that God is moving because of so much of Israel's faith centered around the temple. If the temple is far away, does that mean God is far away? Ezekiel's vision speaks in this moment and says, no, God is with you.
But his call isn't really comforting at first because he is sent to a rebellious people. He's told, hey, why don't you eat this scroll? And the words are full of lament and woe, and he's silenced for a time. And it's as if God is saying, you are only going to speak when I tell you to speak.
And this is where the sign acts come into play that we mentioned at the beginning. Ezekiel becomes this living sign, and he actually acts out this message that God gives him and kind of saying, when words aren't enough, you will embody this. So he lays on his side for 390 days.
Brutal.
Yeah, like, wow. And it is representing Israel's sin, Israel's unfaithfulness. And then he lays for 40 days to represent Judah's sin. And he builds this model of Jerusalem. I think it's out of stones. And then he kind of destroys it. It's this kind of interesting moment where he's acting out this prophecy and saying, this is what is happening. This is what is taking place here.
And so then all of this is leading up to the big event, which is Babylon destroying Jerusalem in 587 BCE. And it's kind of the hinge point of the book. So in that year, Jerusalem is destroyed, and the temple, which is the center of Jewish worship in God's presence, is reduced to rubble, which is a huge seismic theological crisis, which we just kind of mentioned, that we thought that God lived in the temple. So if there is no temple, is God still alive? Does God care? Is God with me? And of course, that we find that that is true. But then the tone begins to shift a little bit after that.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the most difficult things about Ezekiel is how kind of direct he is about idolatry and judgment. It's something that we're probably less accustomed to as a culture, but not accustomed to because of our tradition. We definitely come from a tradition that values openness and speaking hard truth. But in definitely our culture, we tried to not glamorize difficult things. But here he's just like saying it outright. You've defiled the temple. You've turned to other gods. Your hearts have become stone. Very direct.
And so it starts getting a little uncomfortable because we don't like being told things like that. Because Ezekiel uses shocking metaphors, especially in chapters 16 and 23. He begins comparing Israel's unfaithfulness to a spouse who has been unfaithful in the worst ways.
Yeah, very difficult chapters, and they're hard to read. They even use this language that's intentionally just direct and jarring. But the point is that Ezekiel's trying to do is to kind of shake the people awake to the seriousness of their turning away from God.
And I'll say this, like, sometimes this is where it becomes difficult when you just, like, pull a scripture out of the Bible and just read it on its own. You're like, wow, this is super intense. But it's meant to be read as a full story.
Yeah.
And so what happens after this is that Ezekiel does not leave them there.
Yeah.
He's not just angry at them and pronouncing judgment. Instead, after the judgment, there's hope, and that always exists in the story of God and his people. And one of the most famous passages, most likely if you have any experience with Ezekiel, you're aware of the Valley of the Dry Bones. And that's what happens in chapter 37.
Yeah, just a unique image. God brings Ezekiel into this valley full of dry bones and asks, can these bones live? Ezekiel says, only you know, Lord. And then God does something interesting. God breathes life into the bones.
And it's this powerful picture of resurrection. God is saying, although like even the marrow in your bones has dried up, there aren't bones that are dry enough that I could not resurrect them. There is nothing that has gone far enough from me or has died that I cannot do something with. And so it's as if God is saying, I'm not done with you. I am going to give you new hearts, but these will be hearts of flesh and not hearts of stone like you have had in the past. I'm going to bring you back to the land, and I am going to be your God.
So kind of going back to the, I guess, big picture, to ask a question as we think about this series we're going into, why should we care about a book that was written 2,600 years ago to a people who are in this unique circumstance that we call exile?
Yeah, I think one of the big reasons is that Ezekiel speaks to seasons when we feel like we are in exile, when life feels uprooted and the things that we have counted on have crumbled. And, we even at the beginning of the year when we were working through the exile series, the big piece of the exile happenings in the Old Testament, and maybe even many exiles in our own lives now, is that all of the stake that we have put into God acting a certain way or doing thing a certain way, that this must be how God acts. God will continue to surprise us. And when we when we try and force God to be the God that we want him to be rather than the God that he is, things don't turn out well. It's what they start making alliances with other nations. You read Isaiah, the vineyard thing that we've talked about in the last couple of months. Like what is happening in the exile is God is allowing the idols that the people wanted in the first place. Fine, let them be your God then. So what happens? Then Babylon comes and becomes your God.
Yeah.
That's what you said you wanted to be. And so I think it even reminds us that exile, which is kind of displacement and crisis and loss, it does not mean that God is absent. It sometimes in exile, in those moments of like the temple's destroyed, is God even here? Is God going with me? Is this all over? I think that may actually be the place where we hear the voice of God the clearest, because we have shed ourselves of every understanding of what we thought God was, and this is actually when God is speaking.
Yeah, it definitely, and it also reminds us that God's presence isn't tied to a building or place.
Yeah.
Of course, when we gather, God's presence is there.
Yeah.
God,
the people.
Yeah, God goes with us, even in the valley, even when our hearts feel dry and lifeless. God can breathe life again, and it's such a hopeful message, even in places we would never have imagined to encounter. This presence that brings and regenerates and invigorates can bring us back to life once more.
And that presence that is regenerating and reinvigorating every nanosecond.
Yeah.
And what Ezekiel is doing is calling us to put God back at the center, because we're a lot like the people of Judah. We're tempted to put our hope in things that can't save us, into our own security, into our own idols, in our bank accounts, in our political party of choice, in our own country. There are so many things that we're just like the people of Judah, who the prophets are saying, this is not what saves you. You think this is what saves you, and you have gotten it wrong.
Yeah, and Ezekiel also challenges us not to skip past the difficult. There's real pain in this book. There's real sin that has to be dealt with, but on the other side, there's this restoration.
Yeah, and kind of what we were saying earlier, like if you only read the judgment piece, you don't get the whole story.
Yeah.
There is always hope and restoration at the end of the judgment. The judgment is a necessary piece of what has to happen, but God will never leave us.
Yeah.
Just in the judgment, there is always hope and restoration.
Yeah.
And it's kind of where the book ends. There is a vision of a new temple, of a renewed people, and God's glory fills the land. And it turns out that the people's fear in the beginning, that is this thing over, by the end of the book, you go, no, maybe it's only just beginning.
Yeah.
And that's a really beautiful way to end the book.
It's so great. Yeah, so we're super excited as the series unfolds. And kind of an invitation, lean in, sit with attention, and let the hard part speak, and maybe even begin to meditate on and reflect on this prophet's words to a people a long time ago, but also to us today.
Yeah, so this Sunday will be kind of in Exodus, Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3. If you want to begin reading that and letting it kind of simmer in your heart and in your mind, that you could, like you said, meditate on those things. But don't miss the hope. The same God who showed Ezekiel the valley of death, the valley of dry bones, is the same God who did the same thing with himself, Jesus. From the dead, and he is still in the business of bringing life out of really, really dry bones that don't even have marrow left in them. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.